Hello, welcome to the SBS podcast. Our Deaf Ways. Let me introduce myself. My name is Shirley Liu, and I will be your host for this podcast. Today, we have two exciting guests on the show. The first is Darlene Thornton, and joining her is James Blythe, in conversation on Deaf 101. Enjoy the show.
Back when I was young, when I was a teen in 1989, I had gone down to the Stanmore Deaf Club. So we went to the hall upstairs and it was packed to the rafters. So I sat with my mum and looked at the people around us. At the front, someone got on stage and that person was Trevor Johnston. Now, there had been speakers before him, but when Trevor got on stage, he said, "You know the signs that you use, deaf signs, old signs, your signs? Well, they are a real language." Heads started turning. Mum and I looked at each other and people started murmuring, "No, he's wrong, that's rubbish. What do you mean?" Trevor told us that he had done a lot of research comparing different sign languages in America, the UK and so on, and yes, here it was a real language. Now people may say, it's not a real language, but it's true, it is a real language. Everyone looked excited and I sat there wondering. That was a significant time for me back in 1989. Where were you?
How did you feel at the time, Darlene? I was too young to remember, so I don't recall the moment. I wasn't there. I was there, but I was just too young to recall. So tell me what it was like.
I guess at the time I thought, okay. At that time I had different language instruction back then, signed English at school, oralism growing up, Auslan at home, which at the time we called home signs or deaf signs. So when I heard that this was a real language, I thought, okay, good. Well, what's next? Because at the time, I just didn't have any idea of what the impact of this would mean.
Well, interestingly, just after in 1991, the government released a white paper that announced recognition of a sign language, but importantly didn't use the word Auslan. The recognition was essentially acknowledging that deaf people use sign language to communicate. Actually, the description said a community language. Now, this was only a few years later. Even in 1991, the word Auslan was still not used. Do you know when that changed?
Well, James, the term Auslan itself came about from discussions by a deaf group. Now, there were prominent deaf people in the group, and Trevor had asked the group to come up with a name themselves. He didn't want to coin it himself, as the language belonged to deaf people. So through much discussion, they decided on Auslan with a capital A, small case USLAN, which stood for Australian Sign Language.
Yes, sometimes we see Auslan written in the capitals, like Auslan, like it's being screamed, Auslan! But we just capitalise the first letter A and then the rest in lowercase, much the same way we would write English, a capital E followed by lowercase letters.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how many people used the term Auslan throughout the years. Like back then, at the time when it was first announced, there was a big deaf community, but how many people actually recognised that their signs were Auslan? I don't know. Like how many up until now?
It's interesting because the data for that information is negatively skewed. When the census was released, not the most recent one, but the one previous to that, I'm pretty sure it was the one in 2016, there was a strong push from the community to ensure Auslan was written as a language used at home. The main reason was because it's common that most deaf people are from hearing families, and this means that when hearing parents are filling out questions in the census pertaining to the language used at home, Auslan was rarely noted. It was typically the commonly spoken language used at home, for example English, that was nominated and not the sign language. Some deaf people do speak too, so this may have influenced the responses. Of course, when deaf children go to school, they're likely to be using Auslan naturally all day, but when they return home, this might not be the case. Also, there's many hearing people who use Auslan at home too, but this wasn't represented. And as a result, the true number of people using Auslan is underestimated. At the time, there was a gap in the data collection. The good news, however, is that most recent census did prompt users of Auslan to type Auslan if they did use it at home, and this was important progress. I can still recall in the last census, not the recent one, but a few years back, there was a lot of promotion by the deaf community via social media networks reminding Auslan users to remember to type Auslan when they completed the census. There were examples of demonstrations on the internet showing people how and where to write Auslan. We knew at the time there was no provision to simply tick a box. Auslan was not one of the options to choose from. Typically it was the parents or one of the representatives from the household who responded on behalf of everyone and just wrote English, as that's the language most people used at home. This was one of the main reasons why Auslan was missed as a language used. It was an important opportunity missed. That was a shame. Fortunately though, the most recent census did prompt Auslan users to write the word Auslan if they use it at home. It'll be interesting to see the results when they're released this year. I have seen though that some research estimates the number of Auslan users in Australia to be somewhere around 10,000 or 20,000. What do you know about that number?
I would say about 30,000, but then again, I won't be surprised if it's more than that after the recent census. Remember, we have Auslan students, interpreters, parents of deaf children, siblings, partners, children of deaf parents too. So will it increase the numbers or remain around 30,000? I'm not sure. Again, I think the problem is, what do you mean by the term use Auslan? What if there are other people out there using other sign languages too? I mean, we just don't know what's out there. Australia is a very big country with diverse peoples. There may be various sign languages being used and I have no idea of what and how many. I'm looking forward to June when they announce the figures so that we can see the results. Hopefully then that will show the impact of the term Auslan from 89 until now. I mean, how many years is that, James? I'm not really sure, but it's a relatively short time. So, we'll just have to wait and see.
Well, it's interesting because when I think about the community language as it's described, it has evolved somewhat over time. There's been some signs that are no longer used and a number of new signs added. So, definite evolution of the language. Technology too has changed the way Auslan's shared and used. Of one recent example where some of the community were using a different sign for Australia. I was intrigued by this idea. How do you feel about that?
Well, for me, I think that it's a good thing. So this is about our deaf Indigenous people, the First Nations deaf people, wanting to have their own sign for Australia, which I fully agree with and encourage. Though I do think that the new adapted sign needs more discussion with the wider deaf community to see if indeed it can be adapted and changed. Now, as for the Sign Australia itself, well, it's really not my place to say which one is best. Now, I do want to see its acceptance and widespread use in the whole community, but for me, I think the sign can be worked on more, improved to create a better sign which the whole community can agree on. But let's see what happens.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because in spoken language, for example, Australia has only one English word to describe itself, Australia. There aren't any other alternatives, so it makes me wonder. In New Zealand, though, we know that they have Maori spoken language called Aotearoa. They have their own Maori sign language as well as a separate New Zealand sign language. So, yeah, 2 sign languages. Coming back to the Australian context, there hasn't been that evolution because it isn't widely accepted, and of course there are many Indigenous Australian languages.
Different language groups.
I wonder if it's connected to how Australia has some diversity in dialects used between different parts of Australia. What do you think?
Yeah, so at that time, Trevor Johnston had said that Auslan had 2 dialects. So we had the northern and the southern dialect. So the southern was from Melbourne, Adelaide, Western Australia and Tasmania. And then we had the northern, which was New South Wales up to Queensland. So we had 2 distinct areas. But I do think that they had forgotten another few signing groups, like Irish Sign, and now there were a few others, but I think that they had forgotten about those. There are more different diverse signing groups. However, I'm thinking about today, and with the technology, we've got Zoom, social media, Facebook videos. It means that that clear distinction between the northern and southern dialects is getting really blurred as they overlap and become one, which I do think is a bit sad really, because I do love to see the different signs. It's more exciting. You know, when you travelled, you had to adapt your signs to the local dialect, a bit like going overseas. But now that's merging into just one country sign. Well, you know, I'm not sure. How do you feel, James?
Well, there's an interesting example with British Sign Language, whereby, I think it was in the 1980s or 90s, a program called See Hear was taught at schools in Britain, which is a standardised delivery of BSL. And it saw a change to the nuances and dialects that previously existed, and they saw a unified sign language appear. Then, while the program was influencing change, members of the community started to try and revert back to their territorial sign language dialects and styles that was important to them. I wonder if this will happen to Australia or if it's too late. It'd be interesting to see.
I also think that Australia has a different situation compared to other countries in terms of schools. So most deaf schools have gone. Now there is only one left in the south, just one. So it does mean that the transmission or the passing on of sign language is almost non-existent. It means that today deaf children's exposure to Auslan is from a screen, you know, through videos and watching social media. So yes, we need to be more conscious of what signs that we are using, because that then will influence the Auslan use of future generations of people across Australia. And also remember that American Sign Language had a strong influence here from the 90s. Yes, it had a very strong influence, and today we are more aware of this and are now pushing back against ASL now. But then again, now we are seeing more international signs being introduced and used here. Like the sign for I am, the international sign is very different from the Auslan sign, yet it's used more and more. It's doubtful whether people are aware of this or not.
Well, in schools, it was an opportunity for deaf students to see and communicate with other deaf peers. But since the closure of so many deaf schools, we now see deaf kids being one of only a few at a mainstream school, often due to proximity. As a consequence, the language and cultural exchange between deaf students reduced. Previously, deaf people could still make up for what they missed out on at school by attending deaf clubs, but they've closed down as well. So role models for deaf children now are not as accessible anymore. So they're looking up to Auslan interpreters or teachers of the deaf, many of whom learn Auslan later in life, and they're not native users. So there's a big gap in this space. Oh, it's worse in the country as well.
Yes, I always find this one interesting because, well, the government always want to integrate all people into the one mainstream. But now for deaf people, it's a different situation because we need to see our peers who are the same as us so that we understand our own identity, and then integrating in the long term is more successful. But the government don't see this. They want us to integrate from early on, but this doesn't work. At that stage, there is no access to sign language in the mainstream. Now let me go back a little bit and talk about the deaf clubs too. Stanmore has closed. Melbourne's Jolimont has now closed down. Adelaide's has closed down. They have all closed. So now deaf people are meeting in pubs. So they are trying to find other ways to keep the community connected and keep the language and culture alive. So when I now look back to when Australia was first colonised and think about the first signs that were brought here, now to clarify, I'm sure that many Aboriginal people had their own sign languages, but at the time it was never documented, so we don't know what these languages were. That information's gone. But as for Auslan, it has been presumed that the term itself has been used since 1790, but really it wasn't until much later in 1816 when we see that the first deaf convict who used sign language was transported to Australia. This was a deaf man named John Fitzgerald who was transported to Sydney. It was documented that in the courtroom in London, an interpreter was present for the proceedings at his trial. Now, after John, there were other signing convicts too who were transported here. There was an oral deaf person who didn't use signs, but quite a few who did have signed languages. Then in 1825, there was a deaf man from Scotland named John Carmichael who migrated to Sydney, and he was a very proficient signer. So it means then that we have two different sign languages appearing in Sydney in under 10 years. We have British Sign Language in two forms, a Southern English dialect and a Scottish dialect, both happening here in Sydney. Yeah, so we've also found that deaf people also migrated to Melbourne. Mostly it was deaf people from southern England and London who migrated to Melbourne. Now with Sydney, this was really a mixed bag. People came from all over the UK and also some came from Ireland.
Yes, the Catholic schools.
Yes, the nuns had migrated and brought Irish signs with them too. And like I said, there were various deaf convicts with their own dialects of sign. So in the community, you already have this mixing pot of different sign dialects. The school in Sydney was set up by a Scottish deaf man, and that's how the northern dialect of Auslan is more influenced by the Scottish dialect of BSL. A deaf man from London set up the deaf school in Melbourne. From there, the southern dialect prevailed and spread. So there is a distinction between the northern and southern dialects. We were able to meet a deaf person and tell where they were educated by seeing the dialect of Auslan they signed. These days you can't tell where the child learns sign language from. It's a different generation now. It really is. We are talking over 200 years. It certainly has changed over time. See what happens next, eh?
Well, there is talk that the first deaf person to arrive in Australia was Betty, or Elizabeth Steele, but she didn't sign. Is that right?
No, she didn't sign at all. She became deafened. Now, it is said that this happened in jail. In jail that she became fully deaf. Well, it is said that she had some hearing loss before then. Like many people at the time had issues with their hearing, but it was in jail that she lost all of her hearing. She continued to be able to speak, never signed. I've gone through all of the evidence and nothing points to her signing. In that respect, I wouldn't call her a deaf person. She didn't have a deaf identity. Now, most people who use Auslan identify with a deep connection to a linguistic community with its own sign language, culture and history. She just didn't have that. She had her way, which was her choice.
Well, interestingly, the court transcripts make no mention of an interpreter being used, whereas in other transcripts, for other people, it does mention when an interpreter is present. So it sort of confirms Betty didn't use sign language.
Yes, but still though, we would say that anyone with any level of hearing loss can still be a part of the deaf community. Now, to what extent they're a part of the community really depends on whether they are fluent at Auslan, if they are immersed in and support the community, or if they would prefer to speak and socialise outside of the community. Then they would be living more on the edge of the deaf community. Of course, if they need extra support or advice, we would be happy to give that. But whether they want to be part of the deaf community really is their choice. So James, I've seen many of the texts that you've translated into Auslan. So what do you find the most challenging working between Auslan and English?
Well, it's true both languages are different. It's really no different to comparing English with, say, Spanish. They're entirely different. Well, so is Auslan and English. There are some misconceptions that Auslan is simply a sign for word representation of English, or that the two languages correlate in some way. Some say there's an Auslan sign for each English word. Well, it's true in occasional instances, but no more than comparing any other two languages. In one language, there'll be a word for fence, similarly. In the other language, there'll be a word for fence. However, frequently, there's no Auslan equivalents for English words, and vice versa. So the source languages need to be unpacked and understood and then translated to make sense in the target language. So it's important to remember that, just like Trevor Johnson announced in 1989, Auslan is a language in its own right. And we know this because it has its own rules and grammatical structures like any other language. And when we think about Auslan grammar, people will say, oh, I want to learn Auslan grammar. Well, this is great, but what is Auslan grammar? There's a whole host of rules to consider. It's not as simple as reorganising English words with Auslan signs. There's rules and contexts to consider. So much more. But one big thing Auslan is renowned for is its art of telling a story. It relies very heavily on visual displays. In Auslan, we call these depicting signs. Now, these depicting signs are used to depict an action or an entity in a story by using the hands. Now, there's a range of depicting signs. So, for example, this sign is what I would use for drink. I'm using my hands to depict me holding a glass or a cup. Or I might be pouring a beer from a tap. So that's using my hands. Another way of using depicting signs is by describing what something looks like. I might describe what something looks like as in its shape, its size, texture, colour. I might do this to describe the shape of a tree and explain that it's green and has sparkling lights. And then by that description, people would understand it to be a Christmas tree. The third technique we use is depicting the entity in a story. It might be a person, or a car, or an aeroplane, or different types of animals. So this is a person. What's amazing is that Auslan's a three-dimensional language, and unlike English, that is a linear language, Auslan uses layers and space and dimensions to tell a story. For example, the sign for walk is this, acknowledging there are a few variations to this sign. So there's a straight lexical translation from English to Auslan, but I can add expression and pace to my sign to indicate the walk's quite an effort. Facial expression's really important here. Or I might want to explain that I'm going for an enjoyable walk through the park somewhere. I might represent it like this, or I'm walking hurriedly like this. I'm able to depict me walking hurriedly without adding more signs such as hurry, because in English we would need to say, I walked very quickly. But in Auslan, by using expression and movement in my signs, as well as eye gaze, which can show fear or panic, thereby adding layers or tiers to the language to create meaning. So, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I do find this interesting because many people assume that the one sign for walk should be easy and quick enough to interpret and say the word walk in English. But like you said, James, one sign along with the face, eye and body movement takes many more words in English to convey. So one sign but many words. It also depends on the setting where language takes place. There are different levels of register of language. Higher register may be easier to translate, whereas lower register may be more difficult. One of the great things about Auslan is that you can use all of the space around you for language, whereas English is linear and words must come one after the other. You cannot mix words up on the page or it doesn't make sense, and you cannot speak words in a different order or it doesn't make sense. But in Auslan, you can sign stories using all of the space from every angle and multiple perspectives at the same time. It's brilliant. Another thing that I've noticed is that many people assume that fingerspelling is Auslan. I usually have to correct people and explain that fingerspelling occurs to help bridge English and Auslan. If there's any English word that we don't know a sign for or do not have a sign for yet, it could be new terminology that we haven't yet created a sign for, then we use fingerspelling. Or it could be a person's name or place name, we use fingerspelling. But on the whole, people assume and do sign to me, I know Auslan, I say okay, and they fingerspell Hello. Most people think that if they can fingerspell then they know Auslan, and I do have to correct them on this.
Oh, it's more than that.
Yeah, and also I think that it would be good from now to see people become more aware that Auslan linguistics are not easy to understand and are indeed complex, compared to spoken languages which are easy to document on paper, whereas Auslan and all sign languages are so difficult to document in writing. I mean, how do you transfer signs from space onto the page?
Yeah, generally speaking, anyone who wants to learn Auslan as a second or third or even fourth language will aim to be near native. Not fully native, but proficient in Auslan, let's say. And it takes around 2,000 hours. Yep, that's right, 2,000 hours to achieve that level. And people get the wrong idea that if they want to be fluent in Auslan, they can just go to, a community class in their neighbourhood. And this is wonderful. I encourage this, but it's only an introduction to the language, you know what I mean? It'll never be enough to teach Auslan or interpret it or have an in-depth conversation with a deaf person. Community classes are usually somewhere around 12 or 16 hours in length, and that's for each level. And so by the time a person completes 3 or 4 levels, that's probably 30, 40 hours worth, not quite 2,000 hours it takes to become proficient. And it is said For someone to become fluent in any language, whether it be spoken or signed, research commonly states that it requires up to 10,000 hours of practice. So this is a factor I think many people are not cognizant of. So definitely worth being aware of, isn't it? Some people think that Auslan is like a form of Pidgin English or a simplified form of English, but of course Auslan is another language. It's just the same as any other languages that we know. And we need to remember that, because the problem is that sometimes when we sign briefly in Auslan and yet there's a lengthy phrase in English that follows, do you know what I mean? And people might equate that to Auslan being a simple language, but the sign is a construction of complexity and requires elaboration. I have a great example, Darlene. You know, we're communicating in Auslan and have interpreters doing a voiceover for the hearing audience to follow. So check this example out. It'll demonstrate it nicely. While I was sitting down quietly enjoying my breakfast, this person on my left approached suddenly and it scared me so much I dashed off in a flash.
Yeah, exactly.
Darling, we just have to wait a little while for the interpreter to catch up. Ha ha ha. So this is a great way to demonstrate, is it not, that while one language can explain something so succinctly, the other language takes some effort to provide an equivalence. Of course, it doesn't mean any language is simple. It just means that languages are complex and can take some unpacking.
Yeah, and I also think it's a real shame because many deaf children have hearing parents who do not know sign language. So many deaf children are missing out on Auslan at that crucial developmental stage for language learning. Most children are not learning Auslan until much later. Some are starting at 8 and up to even 20. So many people I've met who didn't start learning Auslan until they were in their 20s. They've really missed out on that crucial developmental stage to learn two languages at the same time, or even to have learnt Auslan as a baby so that they have one language to work from, to then build in English as a second language. This method is very successful for children's language outcomes, but many don't have the opportunity. I think it's because many people still think that Auslan is not a real language. So we still really need to teach people that Auslan is a real language. Everyone should have the opportunity to learn it. The priority should be for deaf children to be given this opportunity. For hearing children, yes, it's nice for them to learn it, but for deaf children it's vital for their language development, for the whole of their lives, their mental health, their identity, and to understand who they are and how they belong, how they fit into the world and understand the world around them. This is so important.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, I don't mean to sound boastful, but I do consider myself to be fortunate because my daughter's 19 months old and she's hearing, but she's bilingual because, of course, me being her deaf father and her mother being hearing, she gets access to both languages. And what's interesting is that she can currently speak somewhere around 150 English words and she knows around 150 Auslan signs. So being bilingual means she has the opportunity to access and communicate and express herself at an early age. And as you know, the voice box isn't fully developed at that age, but is able to express herself beyond her peers using sign language, and both languages will develop simultaneously. But at her age, I see her as being advanced for her age compared to most kids, to be honest, because others have commented that she's quite talkative and expressive, and others are shocked when I say, oh, she's only 19 months old, while they're thinking, oh, no, she must be 2 years old. And this is because she has access to both languages, and it's evidence that this makes a difference. And it's the same for other children, that if they're given access to sign language, and I'm talking specifically about deaf kids, while the same applies to hearing children, of course, but for deaf children, they're able to express and communicate freely, and they'll be less frustrated, which would be the case if they can't express themselves or communicate freely. Instead, they'll be able to communicate naturally and comfortably with others and have meaningful conversations. And it's a really precious time too.
That's interesting. You said your daughter has 150 words and 150 Auslan signs. That's a vocab of 300 across 2 languages. That's very advanced. That was the same with my 4 children. They advanced far quicker than their peers in language development. Over time, the other children caught up, but my 4 progressed much quicker. When they were small, I could communicate with them, and other parents would say, your child understands your communication, but it was all about having access at that important time. So I hope that going forward, the deaf community will become more understood in the community as a whole, that it will be recognised that Auslan is important for all people in Australia, that they have access to Auslan from babies to adults. And also it's about recognising that the interpreter in the TV news is using the Auslan language, not just waving their hands around. It's real Auslan access for people who don't access English. This is their language, their access, so that this understanding becomes the norm, and that it's not only captions that are provided. Captions do not always provide access. Auslan also needs to be provided, as this is the language of deaf people. If you want to ensure deaf people are included, then Auslan is the only way to make that connection.
Well, usually when we see an interpreter on TV, it's because of an emergency or a natural disaster, you know what I mean? Such as a fire, a flood, cyclone, or, of course, COVID. So usually because of an emergency. And what therefore happens is when the deaf community sees an interpreter on TV, they automatically assume there's an emergency, and there's a sense of panic and uneasiness because of that. And while there are captions on TV, these captions are in English and not in a deaf person's first language. So parts of the message isn't fully understood, which is compounded because of the sense of panic and anxiety that they're already experienced. This is why it's critical that an Auslan interpreter is positioned on TV so the message is delivered in a deaf person's first language and understood quickly and clearly. I suppose it would be the same situation if a hearing person was listening to an emergency announcement but in their second language, and it would be difficult to understand the full message, and clearly the desire would be to listen to it in English.
Yes, I think also part of the problem is that we need wider recognition of Auslan so that we see its use as one of the main languages in Australia. It really should be up there along with other Indigenous languages too. The profile really needs to be raised, not down there at the bottom of the scale, because at the moment the most widely used is Chinese, specifically Mandarin. Now, it really is fine to have such high numbers of people using Mandarin, but we need to increase the numbers using Auslan, because anyone can become deaf at any time and they need access. Now, as I say, Mandarin is fine, but it is only used in that community. Auslan can be used by anyone, so it really is important to raise its profile. We really do need better recognition from the government, more support, better drivers in education and better access in health, where Auslan interpreters are provided as the norm for any deaf person. Deaf people need to be recognised as equal citizens. It doesn't mean that all hearing people must learn Auslan, no, but there does need to be enough of it around to provide access to people. Now that is good enough. They do not need to be fluent in Auslan, but it needs to be spread more widely. It's the same with the varying abilities in English. Some people are very proficient and others not so, but we accept that. So why can't deaf people have that same level of acceptance?
Yeah, well, with other languages, people can choose what they want to learn and when. But as a deaf person who's unable to use technology like hearing aids, then these people are provided with only one choice, and that is access to the one language they know, Auslan, as English isn't accessible to them. So Auslan interpreters need to be provided, not because it's a good option, but it's the only way we can access information and communicate.
And I think that many people think that cochlear implants will be the fix, that they will become hearing like one of them. But when the technology is switched off or it breaks down, the person is still deaf. And then what access to language do they have? Can they communicate then? The idea of having Auslan is important for anyone who is deaf, because it provides long-term security, a feeling of safety, that knowing that I am okay, I am stable, I'm not stressed or anxious or depressed. Auslan really is a deep and rich language which most people just don't realise. I mean, you and I are lucky, James. We are both from deaf families. We didn't see this problem until we were at school. That's when we saw that the other kids didn't have Auslan, and we did. So I'm really excited now to see what comes next, to see people become more excited about Auslan and ask more questions and see it more widely used. I hope that this podcast will be a good start to see that ball rolling. Now, do you want to say any final comments about Auslan, James?
Well, Auslan is a complex and rich language, and not a simple language to learn, mind you. I'm certainly not trying to scare anyone, but my message is that Auslan deserves to be recognised as a language just like any other language. I guess that's the main point I'd like to make here.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you, James.
Thanks, Darlene. It's been lovely talking with you.
Wasn't that an insightful and interesting conversation with Darlene and James? It really highlighted the importance of Auslan and the deaf community. See you next time on our upcoming podcasts. Thanks for watching.